is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
The invitation was supposed to bring a fractured family back behind the same doors. Instead, one demand changed everything. King Charles had been preparing for a private Balmoral summit involving Prince Harry, when the security question suddenly became impossible to ignore. Then came the decision no one around the table expected. The king cancelled the gathering altogether, transforming what had been planned as reconciliation into another devastating royal rupture. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had chosen Balmoral because he wanted distance from the machinery of London and the tension that followed every royal encounter. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish estate used for retreats and family gatherings, offered something the capital could not: privacy, history, and the chance to speak without ceremony shaping every word. He wanted Harry there as a son, not merely as a duke returning under public scrutiny. That distinction mattered because the meeting was meant to repair trust, not stage another negotiation. Then the final security condition arrived. Harry wanted a separate private security arrangement as a condition for attending, and the king understood what accepting it would mean. This was no longer a question of where cars would wait or which entrance would be used. It had become a test of whether one family member could enter the gathering under rules designed apart from everyone else. Charles read the briefing once, then again. He set it down slowly, exhausted rather than angry, because the choice carried a cost either way. Harry saw the demand differently. To him, security was not a bargaining chip and not a challenge to his father's authority. It was protection, control, and reassurance around the people closest to him. Accepting less would feel like surrendering something he believed should never have been negotiable. That was why neither side moved. The summit had been designed as a bridge, yet the conditions of crossing it were now pulling father and son farther apart. The decision came quickly. Charles closed the security file, pushed his chair back, and looked toward the aide waiting in silence. "Cancel Balmoral," he said. No long argument followed. No second vote. The instruction ended the summit in a handful of words, but it opened a far deeper wound. Because beneath the cancelled meeting sat the question no schedule could answer. Did Charles and Harry still mean the same thing when they spoke about reconciliation? One wanted a private return built on shared terms. The other wanted safety guaranteed on terms he could trust. And as the room fell quiet, the real conflict was only beginning. Behind the security language were two men confronting something far more personal. Charles saw Balmoral as an opportunity to reopen a door that had been closing for years. Harry saw the same journey through the lens of risk, exposure, and control. Neither believed he was asking for the impossible. And that was precisely what made the breakdown so painful. Both father and son felt they were defending something they could no longer afford to lose. Charles stood in silence after the cancellation, struggling with the thought that every attempt to reach his younger son now seemed to arrive wrapped in conditions. He had wanted this gathering to feel like family, not another formal negotiation. Attendance had been deliberately limited so the conversation could stay personal. And that mattered, because larger royal meetings had repeatedly buried emotion beneath protocol. This time, the king had hoped direct contact might achieve what carefully managed exchanges had failed to do. Harry felt the opposite pressure. For him, returning to Britain could never be separated from the question of protection, because every journey carried the weight of exposure and uncertainty. Security was not simply an arrangement around the meeting. It shaped whether he could enter that meeting feeling in control at all. When confirmation finally reached him that Balmoral was off, he gripped his phone and said nothing. Seconds passed. Then he walked away, stopped, and turned back, with anger rising beneath the restraint. Then there was never really a meeting. The sentence hit harder because Harry did not see his demand as rebellion. He saw it as a boundary. Asking to feel protected, in his mind, should never have become a test of loyalty to his father or the family. Yet Charles interpreted the condition through a different emotional lens. He had offered privacy, space, and a direct encounter. Now he feared that fatherhood itself had become something negotiated through requirements neither side trusted the other to define. William remained close to the decision, without being placed between them. The prince believed any private reunion needed one clear structure, not separate terms arranged at the final moment. That mattered, because once different conditions were created for one participant, the meeting stopped feeling like a family conversation and started becoming a contest over authority. Even so, Charles had deliberately resisted using his eldest son as the main intermediary. He wanted Harry to hear his father directly, not through another royal voice. But Harry's reaction revealed something deeper. The security demand had not suddenly appeared at Balmoral. It had been shaped by an earlier moment that convinced him this was the one line he could not bend on. And once that moment came back into focus, the cancelled summit stopped looking like a sudden collapse. It began to look inevitable. The summit did not collapse when Charles cancelled it. By then, the damage had already been done. Days earlier, a private conversation about arrival arrangements had turned unexpectedly cold, leaving Harry convinced that his security concerns would never be treated on his terms. What sounded like a logistical disagreement became something much deeper. From that moment forward, Balmoral was no longer simply a family meeting. It became a test neither side intended to fail. Harry had entered the planning process focused on practical details: timing, accommodation, access, and keeping the visit tightly controlled. At first, security seemed like only one part of the arrangement. But as the discussions moved forward, the gap widened. He wanted greater control over the protection surrounding his arrival and stay, while Charles's side wanted one unified structure around the gathering. That mattered because a unified security plan meant one coordinated system covering everyone involved, rather than a separate arrangement built around one guest. Then the private call changed everything. Harry listened as the proposed protection plan was explained, and his tone hardened almost immediately. What others saw as standard coordination, he heard as something far more personal, a demand to surrender control before the meeting had even begun. The voice on the other end made the position clear. A separate protection structure would not be created exclusively for him at Balmoral. Harry did not hesitate. He said he would not attend without it. The words transformed the entire situation. Until that moment, the disagreement could still be treated as logistics. Now it had become a condition of attendance, and that meant Charles would eventually have to choose between changing the framework or losing the meeting altogether. When the king was told how firmly his younger son had responded, the news wounded him more than he expected. Once again, an attempt at direct family contact had become tangled in authority, mistrust, and the fear that neither side believed the other understood what was really at stake. Harry remained seated after the call ended. The silence around him stretched longer than he expected, but he did not call back. He had already made the boundary clear. "I said what I need," he repeated quietly, not with anger now, but with the cold certainty of someone who believed compromise would cost too much. Charles reacted differently. He refused to make the final decision through advisors or another exchange of carefully worded messages. He wanted one last direct conversation with his son. No long chain of intermediaries, no competing interpretations. Just father and son speaking plainly. And when that conversation finally came, the argument stopped being about security arrangements. It became a confrontation over trust itself. There were no cheering crowds, no ceremonial uniforms, and nowhere for either man to hide. The final exchange between Charles and Harry became the emotional heart of the crisis, because both finally said what months of careful language had concealed. Harry insisted that safety could not be negotiated away. Charles countered that reconciliation could not survive endless conditions. What followed was not a shouting match. It was something colder, and perhaps far more damaging. Charles opened the conversation with one purpose: keep the meeting alive, if there was still any path left. He had deliberately asked for direct contact because too many previous exchanges had passed through aides, written messages, and carefully managed responses. That mattered because every extra layer created room for suspicion. If father and son could speak without an intermediary, the king believed there was still a chance to separate personal hurt from the practical argument that had consumed the summit. Harry entered with the opposite instinct. He had already decided that weakening his security demand would make every future visit vulnerable to the same pressure. For him, this was no longer about one journey. It was about whether returning to Britain meant accepting arrangements he did not trust. Charles listened, then asked the question that cut through every technical detail. Did his son truly believe the family would invite him somewhere unsafe? Harry paused. The hesitation carried more weight than anger could have. He answered that affection and security were not the same thing. Loving someone did not automatically mean trusting every structure around them. The king felt the frustration rise. Every attempt at family contact seemed to arrive with another condition, another boundary, another test of what he was expected to change before the conversation could even begin. Harry pushed back just as firmly. Returning, he said, could not require him to ignore concerns he had carried for years. If reconciliation depended on pretending those fears no longer existed, then it would never be real. Charles heard the words and understood that neither man was speaking only about Balmoral anymore. They were arguing over who had the right to define what trust looked like. Then came the final offer. Charles leaned forward and asked, "Can you come under the arrangements already made?" Harry answered without raising his voice, "Not under those conditions." That calm refusal ended more than an argument. It removed the final space for compromise. Charles sat back and did not threaten him. He did not demand another answer. His restraint was more decisive than anger, because Harry could hear the shift immediately. Persuasion was over. The king had moved toward judgment. Within hours, the question would no longer be whether Harry accepted the arrangements. It would be whether Charles was prepared to change them for him. The most consequential decision was made without spectacle. Charles now faced two identities pulling in opposite directions: the father who wanted his son back, and the monarch responsible for keeping private family arrangements from becoming separate systems of authority. Balmoral could still happen if he yielded. Yet doing so would establish a precedent inside a family already fractured by competing expectations. This time, affection would not be allowed to settle the question alone. Charles reviewed the implications in silence, but the argument had already moved beyond one security request. A separate arrangement for Harry would mean creating different terms inside a gathering that had been designed around one shared structure. That mattered because the meeting was supposed to lower tension, not arrive carrying a new dispute over who received special treatment. The king understood that if every difficult family encounter began with individually negotiated conditions, the private summit would become another arena for power instead of reconciliation. William stayed close but careful. The prince supported consistency, yet he knew this was not his decision to make. He did not tell his father to cancel anything. Instead, he asked the question that cut deeper than advice. If Charles agreed under pressure, would Harry arrive feeling welcomed, or would everyone enter the room already carrying resentment? The future king knew that a reunion built on reluctant concessions could look successful from the outside, while failing emotionally before the first real conversation even began. Charles held the proposed meeting schedule longer than necessary. The practical choice was becoming obvious. but the personal cost remained difficult to accept. Balmoral had represented a chance to sit with his younger son without an audience, without competing statements, and without the noise that had followed them for years. Canceling it meant giving up the very encounter he had hoped might soften that distance. Yet keeping it alive under conditions he no longer believed in felt equally damaging. The decision hardened quietly. Charles concluded that forcing the summit forward would not create trust. It would only move the conflict into the room with them. He picked up the schedule, folded it once, placed it beneath the security briefing, and looked toward William. "We cannot begin like this." The prince did not argue. He understood what those words meant. Charles rejected the idea of restructuring the gathering. No new venue was proposed. No replacement date was offered. The summit would simply end before it began, because the king believed a meeting shaped by pressure would only deepen the wound it was meant to heal. Inside the family, the matter was settled. But Harry had not yet received the final confirmation, and when he did, the cancellation would no longer feel like a decision about Balmoral. It would feel like a decision about him. For Harry, the cancellation landed as more than a scheduling decision. A summit that had carried the possibility of a private meeting with his father was suddenly gone, and the reason attached to its collapse struck directly at one of his deepest grievances. He had believed he was defining a boundary. Charles had treated that boundary as incompatible with the meeting itself. Now both men faced the same silence, and interpreted it in completely opposite ways. Harry read the final confirmation, and felt disbelief turn quickly into frustration. Balmoral would not be rescheduled under the conditions he had requested, which meant the immediate chance for a private family reconciliation had disappeared with it. That mattered because the meeting had become more than a date on a calendar. Charles and William had already been preparing emotionally for his possible return, and he had been preparing himself for the risk of walking back into a family structure he no longer fully trusted. Harry placed his phone face down and walked several steps away. Then he turned back. So that is their answer. To him, the cancellation felt like proof that his security concern had been transformed into evidence that he did not want reconciliation. He rejected that completely. He believed he had asked for protection, not separation. Yet the result was the same. The door had closed, and he was standing outside it again. Charles carried a different kind of pain. He had made the decision himself, so he could not pretend the outcome had been forced on him. The king believed he had protected a principle, but he also knew exactly what had been sacrificed. He had wanted to sit across from his younger son, speak without statements or advisors, and discover whether anything personal could still survive beneath years of mistrust. Now that chance was gone because neither side had been willing to move. Harry began to think beyond Balmoral. If this meeting could collapse over protection, then future private encounters might remain impossible until the larger question of his security in Britain was settled. That possibility made the loss feel permanent, rather than temporary. One disagreement had now become a gate, standing in front of every possible return. Charles refused to make the fracture uglier. The palace, meaning the king's official household and staff, did not launch a public attack or begin assigning blame. He wanted the cancellation to stand without turning his relationship with Harry into another official battle. Silence, in this case, was restraint. But the silence did not mean the king felt nothing. Away from advisors, schedules, and security language, Charles finally spoke privately with William about what the cancellation had cost him. And that conversation would reveal that the decision had hurt far more than Harry realized. Once the advisors were gone, the language of security disappeared with them. There was only a father speaking to his eldest son about the younger one who would not be coming to Balmoral. Charles had defended his decision with certainty in public-facing discussions, but privately, the cost surfaced, and William, who had supported consistency throughout the dispute, suddenly found himself listening not to the king, but to a father wondering whether another opportunity had just been lost forever. Charles no longer needed to argue about the technical details. The summit was cancelled, Harry had kept his boundary, and the decision had already been made. What remained was harder, because there was nothing left to solve on paper. The king had to live with the personal consequence. Every failed attempt at contact made the next one more difficult, and William understood that distance could slowly become its own habit if father and son stopped believing another meeting was possible. Charles finally said what he had avoided saying aloud. "I wanted him there." The words were simple, but they stripped away everything official. He had wanted Harry sitting across from him, not because Balmoral carried some strategic advantage, but because he still wanted the chance to speak as a father. Holding the line had protected the structure of the gathering, yet it had also cost him the private conversation he had hoped might reopen something between them. William did not celebrate the decision. "I know," he answered, "but not like this." The prince had supported consistency from the beginning, but he now pushed the conversation somewhere more personal. Reconciliation could not work if either side entered the room already convinced it had surrendered. If Harry arrived feeling forced, resentment would follow him inside. If Charles changed everything under pressure, that resentment would already be waiting there too. The truth changed something in the king. He stopped treating the cancelled summit as a failed appointment that needed to be replaced immediately. For the first time, he accepted that distance might be less damaging than forcing a reunion before either side was ready to trust the terms of it. That was not surrender. It was a painful form of restraint. William pushed the point further. He reminded his father that loving Harry did not require solving every disagreement at once. The prince wanted him to separate affection from urgency, because urgency had begun turning every opening into another test. Charles listened, and the weight of the decision shifted. There would be no counterattack, no public humiliation, no dramatic retaliation. Balmoral was simply off. But outside those private walls, the story was already taking on a far harsher meaning. By the time the story reached the public, a private disagreement had become something much larger. Balmoral, long associated with royal privacy, family summers, and moments away from official ceremony, was suddenly the symbol of a meeting that never happened. Commentators divided over whether Charles had defended necessary boundaries or abandoned an opportunity for reconciliation. Yet one image captured the mood more powerfully than any argument. Closed gates where a reunion had been expected. Charles now found himself judged from two directions at once. Some saw a monarch protecting consistency, while others saw a father allowing royal authority to overpower a personal chance at healing. That tension mattered, because the cancelled summit had never been only about security by this point. It had become a test of whether family bonds could survive when personal boundaries and royal expectations collided so directly. Harry faced the same divided reaction. Supporters viewed his demand as a reasonable red line, arguing that safety could not simply be pushed aside for the sake of appearances. Critics saw the opposite, questioning whether his conditions had made reconciliation impossible before he ever arrived. The public debate sharpened because both interpretations contained emotional weight, and neither erased the fact that father and son would still not be sitting together. Then one morning, front page crystallized the entire crisis. Balmoral off. The words dominated the newspaper, while broadcasters repeatedly showed the closed entrance to the estate, beneath captions reading, "Summit cancelled." Correspondents described the reunion that had been expected, and the silence that had replaced it. Balmoral, once meant to provide privacy, had now become public shorthand for distance. The absence itself became the story. Charles refused to answer that noise with punishment. The palace, meaning the king's official household and communications operation, kept its language restrained. There was no public condemnation of Harry, no dramatic threat, and no announcement designed to humiliate him. That restraint mattered, because it revealed the emotional line the king was trying to hold. The summit had been cancelled as a boundary, not as revenge. Harry remained equally fixed in his own position. Whatever criticism followed, he had not withdrawn the security condition that mattered to him. And Charles had not reopened the meeting simply to calm the headlines. That was the deeper truth hidden beneath all the public argument. Neither man had won. Both had protected something they believed was essential, and both had paid for it with the same lost opportunity. As the headlines began to fade, the final meaning of Balmoral became impossible to avoid. A father kept his boundary, a son kept his own. And the meeting they both lost became the price of refusing to surrender, either one. In the end, there was no secret victor. Charles did not emerge celebrating the cancellation, and Harry did not abandon the security condition that had defined his return. Both men protected the principle they believed they could no longer compromise, and both lost the same thing because of it. The Balmoral summit became a painful demonstration of how family reconciliation can fail even when love remains, because affection alone cannot erase mistrust, boundaries, or years of unresolved hurt. Charles accepted that there would be no emergency replacement date. Another meeting could only matter if both sides entered it without feeling that they had already been forced to surrender. That mattered because a reunion built on resentment would not repair anything. It would simply move the conflict into another room. The king had chosen consistency, but he now understood the emotional price of that choice more clearly than ever. Harry held his position too. Security, in his mind, could not be separated from any future return to Britain, and that made his refusal deliberate rather than impulsive. He had preserved control over the one issue he believed could not be compromised, but the cost was equally real. By holding that boundary, he had also lost the chance to sit privately with his father at the very moment such a conversation might have mattered most. Charles returned to the original meeting papers one final time. He looked at the cancelled schedule, then removed it from the rest of the documents and set it aside. There was no anger left in the gesture, only acceptance. He had wanted Harry there, but he no longer believed the reunion could be forced into existence simply because both men wished the distance between them were smaller. The truth now stood without disguise. A summit could create a place for reconciliation, but it could not manufacture trust. Invitations, security arrangements, private conversations, and carefully managed conditions could only go so far. If father and son entered the same room, already convinced that compromise meant defeat, no setting in the world could make the meeting succeed. Charles also refused to turn the cancellation into punishment. He did not publicly attack Harry or announce some dramatic retaliation. That decision gave the entire crisis its final meaning. This was not banishment. It was a boundary, and Harry had drawn one too. Balmoral was meant to prove that father and son could still find their way back into the same room. Instead, its cancellation proved something harder. Reconciliation demanded more than a royal invitation. It demanded trust neither man was yet prepared to place in the other's hands. The king made his decision. Harry kept his boundary. And this chapter ended not with victory, but with the unmistakable cost of two men refusing to betray what each believed mattered most. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.